Hello and welcome to another video on TCGplayer.com. My name is Steve Rubin. This week I'm going to be playing with a Bant company deck, but not like I've done in the past, but sort of a new hybrid build using the new Devoted Druid and Vizier of Remedies. This deck comes from two players at GP Kobe who both top 32 with the exact same deck list. Just talking about that aspect of Magic really quick. Whenever I see two people, working on a deck, they play the exact same list. They both top 32 they both do pretty well the tournament. Neither of them top 8'd, but both of them went 12-3. And obviously there are buys there, but excluding buys, that's something like a 20-6 record with the deck. It's possible more people played the deck, but still, it means the deck can put up a really, really solid result. And they got pretty unlucky for one of them not to have just gone 13-2 and top 8 of the tournament. I guess that tournament in particular, that there wouldn't maybe a lot of, X2 went down to 17th place, which is a story for another time. But anyway, I put a lot of weight in when I see like an exact copy of a deck doing well all over the place, kind of. So let's go ahead and just talk about the general things about this deck before I go into individual cards. It's a Bant Nightfall deck, but it also has the Devoted Druid's Vizier of Remedies combo, which gives you infinite mana. And I think that this version is interesting compared to the Abzan versions because it provides you with some extra explosiveness in combo as well as like powerful sideboard cards. I feel as if Devoted Druid is the kind of card right now that just needs to be killed on sight. Like, you can't let your opponent untap with Devoted Druid because for those of you that don't know, you play Devoted Druid on turn 2. On turn 3, you play your third land, and then you can instantly Chord of Calling for 2 because you can tap the Devoted Druid for mana, put a counter on it, go for 2, get a Vizier, and get infinite mana. So it's pretty much, I'm not going to say it's unstoppable, but it's kind of like a situation where you need to kill the Devoted Druid on sight, which means that a deck can take advantage of that by having some great follow-ups, and this deck in particular plays Knight with Retreat, so you stretch the removal really thin. You play a Devoted Druid, they have to kill it. If not, you're probably going to win. If they kill it, you can play a huge Knight. You can play a Witness and get a Devoted Druid back. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about this deck. So we're playing 20 lands in this deck. It's a lot less than decks like this that I've played in the past with Knight of the Reliquary. Usually playing like up to 22, maybe even 23 lands to have like a good toolbox stuff. But this isn't a dedicated Knight deck, and you don't really need that much toolbox. Like, for example, we're not even playing Ghost Chord. All the lands that we have to get are Gavney Township, Kessig Wolf Run, and I have one more, don't I? Horizon Canopy. Oh, they're all right there. I think that, that's enough for the Knights. And in this deck, like Knight getting Kessig Wolf Run, that's important because if you have infinite mana, that gives you a way of winning instantly with the Kessig Wolf Run. Of course, 9 fetch lands, keeping the Knight beefy. You want to really make sure that when you play a Knight, it has 4 toughness if you're playing against any red deck and whatnot. But we have some basics. We have 3 forests, a plains, 1 of each shock land, so a breeding pool, temple garden, a stomping ground, and a hollowed fountain. The stomping ground is, of course, just so we can activate Kessig Wolf Run and cast some sideboard cards. 8 mana creatures, so this deck really wants to get out ahead of you. It wants to force you to use removal on turns you don't want to. I want to play a Birds on turn 1. I want to try to jam a Knight or play a Devoted Druid on turn 2 and really, really get a ton of mana on the board early so I can start accompanying and courting on, really before your opponent starts getting anything going, because Modern's a really fast format, and right now, with all the infinite combo running around, with all the Death Shadow running around that has lots of discard and setup and stuff, you kind of want to get into a spot where you can either just start going off before your opponent, or getting underneath discard, or forcing your Death Shadow opponent to, take a bunch of damage from your creatures, which makes it hard for them to really, set up Death Shadow if a card can Reflector Mage it and whatnot. So anyway, 8 mana dorks I think is nice. You play less lands in this deck to play more mana dorks, making you faster, which I think is important here. Most of the times 4 birds is too many for this kind of deck, but because it's a bad late game draw. But this deck is really a combo deck. It's not really like your old Malira Pod or Knight retreat decks of the past that have great late game. Like, this deck has decent late game, but your late game is just to combo. Like, you're very rarely, unless you're playing against like a Death Shadow deck maybe, going to kill them with attacking through damage. Of course, 4 Vizier of Remedies, 4 Devoted Druid. Just to be clear, you know, just maybe not everybody has played or seen this deck played. Vizier of Remedies makes it so that if any of your creatures would be put a -1/-1 counter, that counter -1 are put instead. So if you put 1 counter on it, it just gets 0 counters. Which essentially with Devoted Druid is infinite mana, because you can untap Devoted Druid infinite number of times, and then you make infinite mana. Generally, what you want to do is you can either have a Dusk Watch to draw your whole deck, or to get your Walking Ballista eventually to just burn them out. Interesting to see how much play Walking Ballista has seen in Eternal formats like Modern and even like, you know, Vintage and obviously Standard. It's kind of like a card that did not look very good. Looked like a solid card, be good in Standard, and it's just been everywhere. 2 Dustwatch Recruiter. Not thrilled with this card because I don't think this card is that great on its own, but it is pretty nice card that obviously you need some number in your deck so that when you like have infinite mana, you want to be able to win. So either you can company right into it, or you can just have it and draw your whole deck. But the other thing is that I don't think this is the worst card on its own, because if you do get it to flip, that can be pretty potent. If you like want to hold up company, you know, you can pass turn, and it's just another threat. Like I said before with Devoted Druid and Knight, they pretty much have to kill them right away, or you're going to carry away with the game. Like a Dustwatch Recruiter, like if I play Dustwatch Recruiter, if I play a Birds on turn 1 and a Dustwatch Recruiter on turn 2, and on turn 3 I pass, and this flips, and I'm holding up Coco, like they're in a really tough spot because the Recruiter is pretty nice. Like with cards like Eternal Witness and Reflector Mage in my deck, I can get a ton of extra mana off the Dustwatch Recruiter and really kind of explode onto the board, and that can, you know, really put your opponent in a tough spot. And I'll go over the retreats in a second. 4 Witnesses. Now, 4 Witnesses is a lot. That is kind of, we're reaching like too many territory, especially for a deck that doesn't have cheap spells. Like a lot of time, Eternal Witness is nice, and you've seen people like Jeff Hooglin like use it to their advantage in the Chord decks, playing a bunch of Eternal Witnesses with like Path to Exile, or even like in an Abs End deck, Abrupt Decay. Just rebuying the cheap removal spells to recast them is a really good way of taking over a game. This deck doesn't actually play any removal in the main deck, but basically this is like trying to make our combo better. We can rebuy our Devoted Druids. We can, you know, force them to kill our Knights. So it does let you rebuy important parts of our combo. And then, of course, with Collected Company and Chord, mostly with Coco, this deck doesn't often discord for Witness as much as I've seen other decks do. But if you Coco into the Eternal Witness, you just can get the Coco back, fire again, and you have so many combos in this deck that, you know, eventually that's going to kill your opponent. 4 Reflector Mage. Now, this is the interesting part of this deck, because when I saw this deck, I was like, wow, it's got 4 Reflector Mages in the main and no Spell Quellers. And I was thinking about that, because I was thinking about, at first I was like, man, that must be so wrong. Like, there should be Spell Quellers somewhere. But thinking about it more, I think that Reflector Mage is kind of nice in the current metagame, because I think that Spell Queller is a bit clunky. It doesn't let you exactly, you know, it's very obvious sometimes when you have it. Obviously, it works kind of well with Collected Company, but it's not that threatening to, like, play a Spell Queller. Like, example, if I'm holding up mana for Coco or Spell Queller and they play a good spell, if I, like, play a Spell Queller to counter it, I'm not really doing my thing. And a lot of the times, like, decks in Modern have a lot of removal, especially fair decks. So if I'm Spell Quelling their thing, on their next turn, they can just spend 1 mana to, like, Fatal Push it or Path it, and then they get their spell back, and then I'm just down a ton of mana. And it took me a while to realize, yeah, when I go, sometimes you go Birds, like Spell Queller, turn 2, turn 3, and you win. But it's not as clean as I always thought it was, and I think that Reflector Mage is in a pretty good spot right here, because you really want to be able to beat the other Devoted Druid decks, and I think that that's what this deck may do well, because you have like another combo with a beefier creature, right, with Knight and Retreat. You have Static Casters, and you have Reflector Mage. I think that being able to Reflector Mage your opponent's Devoted Druid to set them back while they still have to deal with your combo is pretty important. Also, I think that, you know, there are a lot of Eldrazi-tron decks running around. There are a lot of Death Shadow decks running around, and Reflector Mage is excellent against Death Shadow. I used to play it in the sideboard of the Bant, just the fair, the fair version of this deck, And it was excellent because, you know, when you're playing against that deck, they deal themselves so much damage. And if they play a Death Shadow or even a Goyf, you know, and you Reflector Mage it, they can't play it on the next turn. They just usually die because the Reflector Mage, like, if they're at 7 life, you Reflector Mage and a few other creatures, you know, that's going to be a huge threat. Makes our companies better, and yeah, I mean, it's obviously not. There's going to be some matchups. You know, you play against like a Lantern deck or something, and you Reflector Mage instead of Spell Queller. It's going to feel really bad, but I think that currently, like, the way that people beat this deck is by putting tons of pressure on it, or just having Devoted Druid combo themselves. So I think it fits. I think it fits in this deck, and we'll see how it goes today. 4 Knight of the Reliquary. Already went over the lands you have to get with 2 retreats. Another infinite combo. Just a great threat. Makes your companies so much better because instead of hitting like, that's the thing about, you know, Abzan is like you're hitting like a Kitchen Finks or a Viscera Seer or something. This deck's hitting a Knight of the Reliquary, which is a huge threat on its own. Very good at putting a clock on your opponent. Also generates you mana, which like many of the things in this deck do, which can be very nice for setting up a win. Kind of card that gives you some utility, though I'm surprised that this deck doesn't play more, but we'll get into that when we get to the sideboard. And it lets you play Retreat, which with Retreat is a 2-card combo to like go through your deck and make a giant knight. 4 Cocos, pretty self-explanatory. You know, you're playing a Coco deck, you're playing a Chord deck. Chord, not really as much of a toolbox as just a brute force, I'm going to get my combo pieces kind of Chord deck. You know, a lot of times you see the Kiki Chord kind of control, or sometimes the Abzan decks that play like, they'll play like 1 Viscera Seer and 1 Malira and like 3 Kitchen Finks and use Chord as a control-y card, not really to necessarily combo, but, you know, flexibility. Against combo decks, it's like a combo card. Against control decks, it's a control-y card. But here, it's really just getting redundant pieces, you know, which I think is really nice. Like, there's not that much fooling around with like, oh, I have a 1 of this and a 1 of that. No, the Chord, you know, the Chord is just going to get you a Devoted Druid, it's going to get you a Vizier, it's going to get you a Knight. But yeah, importantly, the synergy is if you need Chords in your deck, obviously, because Devoted Druid is just so busted with Chord. You play the Devoted Druid on turn 2, and then your opponent has to kill it. Otherwise, you get infinite mana on turn 3 because you can just Chord for 2 to get the Vizier. Anyway, we're moving on to the sideboard because I'm taking a bit longer than I had planned for this deck tech. We have 2 Scavenging Oozes. You know, good against any Jund-style decks that are trying to kill all your guys. Good against any graveyard strategies. 3 Path to Exiles. Good against decks like Affinity, decks that are trying to play a big creature like Death Shadow, or even, you know, a mirror match. I think paths are okay. Just, even though they're not great against mana creatures, I think that having very cheap interaction to break up combo is pretty important. 1 Forge Tender, just to deal with anger, and is also a fine card against mono red, any burn deck. Could potentially side it in against a deck like Valakut that is trying to play like 3 or 4 Angers post-board against you. 3 Unified Will. I actually really like Unified Will. I've always had it. I've always had a split with Unified Will and Negate, but with this deck with so many mana creatures, it's very easy to get more creatures than your opponents. Can be a liability sometimes against control, but I think it's still solid. 1 Qasali Pride Mage. 3 is it Staticasters. Sorry, I should talk about the Pride Mage, you know, just so you can kill Ensnaring Bridge, so you can kill Cranial Plating. I think it's having 1 in your 75 is important because you can Chord for it or accompany into it, so makes sense to have something that can kill artifacts or enchantments. Pretty self-explanatory. 3 Staticasters. Might be too many because I've found in the past many times that this card is a lot harder to cast than it looks, but I think that it's important because you need this to beat Affinity, or decks like Infect. The one thing I don't know about this card is if you sided it in the mirror or not, because it does kill your own creature. Like if we both have Noble Hierarchs, it kills both. If this was just a normal pinger, it would obviously be great in the mirror because it can kill their mana creatures, it can kill their Vizier of Remedies, it can kill their Eternal Witnesses. Keep them off being able to Chord for anything. So we'll see. I'm going to try it out if we play a mirror. And by mirror, I mostly mean a pseudo mirror, like against any other version of this deck, like a Naya or an Abzan version. And now, this is the only deviation I've had from the deck that I saw at GP Kobe, is we're playing, instead of 2 Meddling Mages, which is a card I just don't like very much, playing an Eidolon of Rhetoric. Very potent card. Like, when I've always played 1 and even 2 of this card in the sideboard of the company decks, and now that I have Chord, it's just so disgusting against many decks. Like, there are many decks that just can't really beat it and have to deal with it, like ad nauseum. We're talking about decks like Infect, decks like another really good one is the Storm deck, because they usually only have Bolt, and they really have trouble beating Eidolon. Also, there's a lot of fringe decks. There's decks like Living End, there's decks like Clan Ironworks, all of which are really soft to Eidolon. Honestly, should I just put another Eidolon in this deck? It sounds so good. Love it. Love it. Mid deck tech. I'm just gonna cut a Static Acid for one, because it's just such a nail in the coffin against those decks. And a lot of them don't have great answers, and they don't expect it, or they're like, if they play it, I'm just dead. Which I love just having it. When my opponent's like, oh, if you played an Eidolon, I just lose, I'm not prepared for it. I just love to have it, you know, because when you have it, you win, and you know, it's a very satisfying feeling. And one Bojuka Bog. Other difference, I think that Bojuka Bog is, if you're playing Knight, you should play one Bojuka Bog, because it's just so excellent against Dredge. Like, and it's such a low cost. It's one sideboard slot. Not to mention there are other decks that it's randomly good against, like decks like Living End and stuff like that. So just play a Bojuka Bog if you're playing Knight. It's very silly not to put one sideboard slot into it. Anyway, that's the deck tech. Took a little bit longer than expected. Felt pretty clean, so thanks for tuning in if you've got it this far, and I will see you guys for round 1.